Hi folks, my name is Mike Dobbs. I'm your host for Government Matters here on Focus Springfield, and it's my privilege and pleasure to be speaking with State Senator Jacob Oliveira. Jake, thanks for coming by.
Glad to be back, Mike.
Okay, so we got a lot to talk about. We'll shove that to the side right now. Don't worry, we'll have time. But I really want to hear about what your agenda is for this legislative session. What have been people talking to you about? What is there leftover stuff from the last session that you want to tackle? What's going on?
So, first of all, we came off of the heels of probably one of the most successful legislative sessions, even though it was delayed for many different reasons when it came to the legislative calendar. We passed things, close to the deadline before the 31st of January of 2024, but pretty proud of what we were able to accomplish and build upon the successes that Massachusetts has already had. Massachusetts ranks #1 in education. #1 in healthcare, #1 state in the country to raise a family, #1 state right now to be a woman in, which I think is pretty important. But there are things that are challenging, even within the areas that we're strong with. When you take education, for instance, and you look at the system of education we have here in Massachusetts in our K through 12 system, the city of Springfield, city of Chicopee, city of Holyoke benefited greatly from the investments made in the Student Opportunity Act over the last 5 or 6 years, which has allowed the city to be the first school district in the entire Commonwealth to offer universal pre-K. Shouldn't be just limited to the city of Springfield. I think every gateway city and every school district should have the opportunity to do that. So one of my goals this session is to work within the funding formula, not to roll back the investments that we've made in Springfield, Chicopee, and Holyoke, but to build upon it for every school district, for our rural school districts that are being impacted significantly by declining student population and rising special ed costs, for our suburban school districts, like the one that I spent 12 years on the school committee on in Ludlow. We haven't seen the benefits of the Student Opportunity Act that other areas have. So I've worked with my colleagues to file legislation, and Governor Healy prioritized that in her State of the State. The leader of my chamber, Senate President Karen Spilka, has prioritized working with that funding formula to change the inflationary rate to better capture the inflationary costs that are impacting our schools. And that has a trickle-down effect to everybody that lives within the community. If you're a homeowner, your property taxes are directly tied to the level of support that you get from the state. Right. Your rent is tied very closely with the level of support that you get from the Commonwealth. So upping that funding formula to really capture that inflationary cost could have benefits for all 351 cities and towns and the roughly 400 plus school districts that we have in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Under healthcare, healthcare is probably the area that's most a mystery, I think, to folks because of the amount that we spend on it. That's typically a partnership between the federal government and the state government. 55% of the Commonwealth's budget is spent on healthcare. In fact, our largest employers in a lot of our regions are our healthcare sector. My district alone, Bay State Health, is my largest employer with nearly 5,000 employees that live in my district alone. It's our largest employer here in Hampden County. 71% of their revenue comes from Medicare and Medicaid. So making sure that we have an efficient system of healthcare, something that I'm interested in, but we also know that there are major gaps and equity issues within healthcare here in the Commonwealth. So I filed a bill this session to address the issue of primary care doctors. During the pandemic, I was dropped from my primary care doctor. It took me, a state senator, nearly a year to find a primary care doctor to get the annual physical that everybody deserves to have and should be getting. We have serious gaps in the number of primary care doctors and physician's assistants that exist. I filed a bill this session to create a physician's assistants compact, which allows people who are licensed in other states to come to the Commonwealth of Massachusetts and get a job right away so we can attract people in so we can solve that issue. I've also filed a piece of legislation working with my colleague in the House, Representative Kilcoyne from Clinton, on something called biomarker testing. And biomarker testing is something that's mostly used in cancer research and development right now. And a biomarker test is an expensive test, but it can save the system money long term. So what it does, if you get a biomarker test, it can look at that genetic mutation and pinpoint the specific therapy that you need to treat that particular cancer. And in fact, I just met a woman recently who had a biomarker test. Without the biomarker test, she would have likely have gone through multiple rounds of chemotherapy that impacts your quality of life, likely loss of hair, loss of appetite, all sorts of awful side effects. Because of that biomarker testing that she had at the beginning, she was able to take something orally, so a pill that she could take a couple times a day. Now she's cancer-free. And so that biomarker testing saved her all of that pain and suffering that she would have had going through that treatment. If we can identify what that particular treatment is early on, then we can save our system money. We can also improve the quality of life for the Massachusetts residents. Problem is right now, only 40% of insurers cover biomarker testing. My bill would force insurers to cover that for all insurance plans here in the Commonwealth.
You would think, common sense would tell you that everyone would support that instead of 40%, simply because it also saves them money.
Yes, in the long run.
In the long run.
In the long run.
By not having to pay for treatment programs that aren't effective, that doctors then, they're evaluating this on the fly, basically.
Exactly. And there's more work to be done in that field. In the research, I was just at BU's medical school in Dorchester this past week talking with scientists who are looking at it. Several states have already passed this measure to require insurance companies to provide this biomarker testing, but they're also doing research with chronic diseases like Alzheimer's. Which is something that's growing as people are living longer. They're now facing, cognitive disorders that impacts their quality of life. If we can expand biomarker research right here in our backyard in Massachusetts, we could be saving families, we could be saving people's lives, and the quality of care that we provide, not just saving money. So a couple of the bills that I'm kind of looking forward to this session. Another area in education is the major investments we made in our public higher education sector. So community college was made universally free this year. Enrollment at our two closest community colleges to us, STCC and Holyoke Community College, it's up double digits right now. But we also know that we need to include those wraparound services to allow students to succeed, to get the credentialing that the business community wants within our communities. But we also need to update the physical infrastructure of our campuses to meet 21st century learning. Springfield Technical Community College, National Historic Landmark. You break a window there, costs 3 times as much because it needs to meet the National Historic Standards. Okay. So Governor Healy has filed a $2.5 billion deferred maintenance capital bond bill for higher education. We need, as a legislature, to pass a bond bill as well to allow the Commonwealth to invest in our community colleges, invest in our state universities, invest in UMass, because the return on investment for us isn't just the benefit to the students that are attending, it's also good for the construction industry and for the high-skilled trade, blue-collar jobs that are well-paying to build out and renovate these college campuses. I see that on the horizon this year as well. We also need to build upon some of the successes that we had last session with our transportation system. I know you noticed before I said Massachusetts is #1 in education, #1 in healthcare. We rank near the bottom in transportation, and that is something that we need to change. Governor has laid out in her transportation spending plan to change the Chapter 90 funding formula, which is the lifeblood to cities and towns for road and bridge and sidewalk and culvert constructions. Legislature has put in place different buckets to try to help out Western Massachusetts within that. So the current funding formula for that large bucket of funds is based on 3 factors: population, miles of roadway, and number of jobs within that community. Obviously, in Western Mass, we don't have the population, we don't have the number of jobs that the eastern part has, so we get shortchanged on the mileage side of it. So the pocket of funds that Governor Healy is talking about expanding this program to using fair share dollars would be mostly based on miles of roadway, which would disproportionately help Western Mass communities because we have more miles of road and we rely on it more. But there are more areas that we need to invest in. You know, this last budget cycle we made regional transportation, our 15 regional transportation agencies like PVTA, we made them universally free for folks this year as a pilot program, hoping to continue on the success of that and not just invest in the MBTA, but invest in our regional transit authorities that Western Mass people rely on to get to and from work, to and from doctor's appointments, to and from the grocery store. So those are two areas where I think regional equity will play an important role when we begin to spend down some of our transportation dollars.
Okay, so you mentioned transportation. You know, I'm going to ask you about an update on West East Rail. I started saying East-West, and someone's been correcting me. You should say West first. Okay. I just noticed that there was a meeting in Palmer to discuss the idea of Palmer having a stop. I'll be frank with you, that concerned me a bit because part of the selling point of this new rail system will be how quick and efficient can you get from one end of the state to the other end of the state. And while the concept of the high-speed rail, I think, has been sort of diminished, I know that Palmer wants a stop. I understand why. But then if we give Palmer a stop, do we need to give Chester a stop? Because the arguments for both of them are about the same, which is you're serving a population that would have to travel in order to a fair distance. So if you're in the hill towns, this means you got to go to Pittsfield to get the train. You're from Palmer, you got to come to Springfield. And so I understand the arguments, and at the same time, though, I'm worried that it's going to add more time to the trip, and adding more time to the trip could discourage ridership because that's always an issue. And I'm just wondering, number one, has there been additional discussions about West East Rail since the press conference that Congressman Neal had not too long ago? And also, are there any other communities that are hoping to get a stop or have voiced their interest in getting a stop on the new route?
It's not an idea for Palmer. It's going to be a reality. That is in every single plan is Palmer to have a stop. And I'm going to tell you, it's very different than actually Chester. And I'm going to tell you the difference. It's not a stop along the way between Worcester and Springfield. It is entirely focused on the ability for folks in the 5 colleges at the University of Massachusetts and the other colleges, the 4 other colleges around it. They're not going to utilize Springfield to get on a train. They're going to utilize Palmer. So Palmer is in a very different situation than Chester. Chester's a smaller community in between with not a lot of large population centers around it. Palmer's very different. It is, 25 minutes away from the University of Massachusetts. It is right along 181 from Route 9 to 181 to connect up using PVTA to connect up to that train station. And it is going to be a reality. So every one of these plans, it's not an idea. Palmer is set in stone in Compass Rail.
Let me just interrupt you for a moment.
Yep.
Okay, so when you talk about PVTA, is there going to be funding for a dedicated service? Because obviously, if you're going to get people from Amherst and specifically UMass to use this, there's got to be a dedicated service for rail for buses, obviously.
We've already been in discussions with PVTA. They constantly look at the bus lines to meet the demands recently. I was just talking to Sandy Sheehan, the executive director of PVTA, talking about the new Ludlow line. So they are constantly moving things. Unlike rail that's set somewhere, buses use roads, so they can change the lines a little bit more easily. They changed, after constituents reached out to me to reach out to the new, or not new now, but the Belchertown courthouse that's there for the Eastern District of Hampshire County. They were able to tweak that route from Belchertown Center, where the courthouse used to be, right down the road very easily. So conversations have already been started with PVTA to create that direct connection to the Palmer stop once it's established. But Palmer is strategic. Palmer was built on the railroads.
Right.
You know, my grandfather was from Palmer, grew up there, remembers the troops going to World War I, leaving from the Palmer stations that existed. They actually had a larger population during its heyday than most of my communities now that have larger populations than Palmer. It is a historic center for it. And so it won't likely be a station that we think of like a Union Station. It'll likely be a stop like you would see in Windsor, Connecticut, or the stop you see in Holyoke for the Valley Flyer, as a place where it can stop along the way. But I think, you know, when you look at the line in general, it would start, you know, if you want to go east to west instead of west to east, as I typically go, starting in Boston, Framingham, Worcester, Palmer, Springfield, Pittsfield. That's not a lot of stops in there. And actually the trickiest part of West-East Rail actually happens between Palmer and Worcester. The tracks between those two cities, those two communities, are windy. They follow the road, the river beds that are there. And so part of the federal funding that Congressman Neal, our congressional delegation with Senator Warren, Senator Markey, and Congressman McGovern is $100 million plus to fix those tracks in between so it can create that higher speed to make passenger rail a reality. I don't think Palmer will slow it down much. I think it will only add to the efficiency and the benefit of West-East Rail becoming a reality. In my conversations with Andy Koziel, who is our rail administrator for Compass, who we chat frequently, and the transportation secretary, they are completely committed to that Palmer stop. And those improvements in Palmer to that area, as well as Pittsfield, are some of the major stop areas that we're trying to fix. But I will say with West-East Rail, and it's kind of unpopular to say in Western Massachusetts, but there's work to be done in the Boston area to get that number of trains from Western Massachusetts to the Boston area. So we call it the Alston-Brighton flyover. So it's that area in the Mass Turnpike, right where there used to be the Alston-Brighton tolls. That is a large area of old railroad beds. We need to ensure that there's enough room there for more train activity to go through. And then going into South Station, there's improvements that need to be made in South Station as well in order to accommodate the level of traffic coming from the west that West-East Rail would provide. So all that to say that Compass Rail is continuing to be something that is prioritized by the Western Mass delegation, but also Governor Healy and our congressional partners as well. Governor Healy mentioned it in her State of the Commonwealth address. It is a priority for her, it's a priority for us, and it will be a reality within the next decade.
Okay, now before you send me hateful emails, people from Palmer, I love Palmer. My wife and I go there all the time. She likes taking her dad to Gurley's Grill. We go to the antique centers, so I'm not dissing Palmer. It's just with the talk about adding stops, I just get concerned about the efficiency. So Palmer is in stone. I take it Chester would not be in stone.
Not as of yet. I haven't. They have said throughout all the different plans within the Compass Rail that Chester is not a viable stop as of yet. That could change in the future. You can always add stops later on, but the plan is right now Boston, Framingham, Worcester, Palmer, Springfield, Pittsfield.
Okay, and just as another side note, because again, my wife will take her dad to Steaming Tenders. I noticed that they had a meeting about the possibility of incorporating a rail stop where there was a rail stop, because Steaming Tenders was the train station for Palmer for decades and decades and decades. Of course, it's now a fine restaurant. Do you think that's going to be a reality, or the construction of a stop like we have in Holyoke is more likely?
I think more likely is a construction of a stop like we see in Holyoke, because when you get into the bottleneck of that area, it's hard for trains to pass by on either side. So it might be difficult. My goal is, as someone who represents Palmer in the legislature, is having a stop as close as possible to the downtown area. And some of the options that Compass Rail has put forward have called for a stop very close to the downtown area, which can only benefit the businesses, but also you want to have enough room for parking You want to have enough room for turnarounds for buses that are coming down from the Amherst area as well. And so I think, the build out of a stop will likely be focused on a platform rather than an actual station, but it would only go to benefit the downtown area where the steaming tender is located as well in the historic district.
Okay, let me just check the time. Okay, time is checked. Let's talk about this past week. And we talked about when Senator Gomez and State Rep Gonzalez was here, we talked a little bit about this. But that was a couple of weeks ago, and now we are in full-fledged in a new reality. We're in a Trump administration that within his first, 10 days, he signs all these executive orders, a absolutely bewildering number of executive orders, even for hardcore political watchers, to try to keep track of what was being done. But the thing that really got the national attention was this, what was termed as a pause in federal funding, grants, other funding devices, to an incredibly long list of recipients affecting people. And I think a lot of times people think, oh, well, it's just the federal stuff. No, the federal stuff is like right down into your neighborhood. The federal stuff affects you. It affects your neighbors. It affects your community, whether you're in Springfield or Palmer, for instance. And my question to your two colleagues is the same question I'll give you, which is, we're entering this unknown territory, and the general tone is that states need to pick up more expenses. How is that, and I know this is hypothetical, and I apologize, I don't like hypothetical questions myself, but looking at what the federal government funds in Massachusetts, the idea of that funding either going away in part or complete, depending upon the program, is really daunting. And it's daunting to a state on how they are going to pick it up. Is this something that you guys have been talking about, especially in the last week, where it's like, can the state fill in these gaps? Will the state be required to fill in these gaps?
So first of all, Mike, even though that this new administration has only been there 2 weeks, it feels like 2 years. And for us, it's a constant battle of the fear that's been instilled in, people, especially marginalized communities, starting off with some of these executive orders. And then to have the last week to say that you're going to pause federal funding for everything but Social Security and Medicare, people don't really understand how this impacts everybody's everyday lives. So taking out Social Security and Medicare, how this pause would impact, by the way, this pause is unconstitutional. The Congress has the power of the purse strings. The president doesn't have the authority under the Constitution or the 1974 Act that says you can't pick and choose what you want to fund because Congress has the power of the purse strings. It is wholly unconstitutional. It's tyrannical. It is counter to what we fought 250 years ago for representative democracy, to send people that are our elected representatives to decide our future of our nation. He is throwing that out the window and trying to test the boundaries of where the public will accept his type of rhetoric, his type of authoritarianism, and his type of hate that is sown within his administration, first off. But if you take the programs that impact residents of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, that pause would impact farmers. Loans for our farmers here in Western Massachusetts to deal with things like the floods that impacted us, for things like getting over the hump of the winter time when you're beginning to plant your seeds in the spring and harvest. Federal funds are important to our local farmers, number one. Another area that's really big for folks, school lunch program. This year, the legislature made school lunch universally free for every child in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. We do that by using federal funds. If federal funds are put on pause, our food service directors within our school districts don't have the funding to actually purchase food for kids in schools. When you look at putting a pause on things like Head Start, how are people going to go to work if their kids aren't going to get the early childhood education that they deserve if their parents have to stay home with them? That'll impact the economy throughout the entire area. You look at our two major industries in Western Massachusetts. I just said before, my largest employer is Bay State Health. My second largest employer is UMass Amherst. You start cutting on the healthcare side, Medicaid, which said before, 71% of Bay State funding is Medicare and Medicaid. You start tinkering with Medicaid funding, that'll impact the state's budget. That'll impact local communities' budgets. That will impact our largest employer in this area and cause dire consequences to our healthcare system and to the employees that work there. You start cutting NIH funding and the grants that higher ed institutions get. You look at the wonderful higher ed institutions that we have right here in Western Massachusetts, you begin to put a pause on that funding, and all of those positions that rely on that grant funding for life-saving research that we all rely on could be thrown out the window. So that trickle-down effect is going to hit us in Massachusetts, even if you start tinkering with these programs. He's already said that Medicare and Social Security are off the table. Medicaid, when you look at the state's budget, if the federal government starts pulling away from Medicaid reimbursements to the state, that will leave a massive hole in our Commonwealth's budget. And, you know, us focusing on healthcare and the safety and well-being of our residents, we'll likely have to backfill it, which means we will have less money for transportation and education and all the things that we want to invest in, which will trickle down to the local taxpayer because our 351 cities and towns won't have the money to pay for basic services, which means they'll be in a position of either slashing services or raising property taxes, which will hurt homeowners and renters that are already struggling to afford to live within our communities. So the trickle-down effect of these Trump policies that would say in the name of efficiency covers up from all the other hateful things that this administration is doing, including the waste of taxpayer funds by laying off and eliminating 17 of our inspectors generals that are watchdogs of federal funds in our departments, and he puts in place in their stead this Office of Government Efficiency, which, you know, I would love to make government more efficient, but you don't put oligarchs in there and tech bros who are lining their pockets on the backs of taxpayers and are a new version of the robber barons because of their proximity to government. That has an impact on the taxes that you pay, Mike, and the taxes that I pay to the federal government. And in a state like Massachusetts, which is a giving state, we give a lot more to the federal government than we get back because we're a wealthier state. The impact on us is even greater. And I'd like to thank our members of our congressional delegation for continuing to put the pressure on this administration. The Congress does have the power of the purse strings. They need to exercise that power and take it back from the federal government, from the president, who is trying to undermine them at every turn and sidelining the number one branch of government, which is the legislature, our Congress.
I know that the state has its, municipalities have their stabilization fund or their rainy day fund. I know that a lot of municipalities struggle to try to build that up. Just like you and I and everyone else has a savings account, and we want to squirrel money away in case of an emergency. I know the state has got its own stabilization. But I'm assuming, and please correct me, that money isn't enough to fill in all the gaps if federal funding goes away.
So in Mass, you look at our total, expenditures in fiscal year 25, which is our latest one, it's roughly around $60 billion. Because of sound budgeting and our fiscal responsibility in the legislature and in the governor's office, prior to the pandemic, we only had about $2 billion in the rainy day fund. Because of strong budgeting and increased revenues over the last few years, that has ballooned to $9 billion. Our budget, though, relies on about 13 to $15 billion in federal funding coming in each year. That $9 billion is a drop in the bucket.
It's gone within
It's gone within less, if that is cut, our $9 billion that's in the rainy day fund, if it's raining, is wiped out right away. What do you do for the next fiscal year? So that's why the precarious position that the Trump administration are putting states in, and it's not just states that voted for Harris in the last election. It's states like Mississippi and Louisiana and Alabama that voted overwhelmingly for this administration. The impact it will have at the state level is profound if some of these federal programs are rolled back. And the largest chunk of those federal funds that comes to us is in the form of Medicaid, because the largest chunk of our state budget is spent on health care, and it's a partnership with the federal government through our expansion of Medicaid to provide coverage, which makes Massachusetts the #1 state in the country for health care, but also the #1 state for coverage. There are certainly areas that we need to work on within that to provide more equity, but not having a reliable federal partner sends states and communities into a tailspin if we don't have that reliable partner at the federal level.
Thanks very much for watching this episode of Government Matters here on Focus Springfield.